And welcome to our last video lecture for Lesson 3. This lesson will be looking at Notes 3G, available on Google Classroom. I encourage you to have these notes downloaded or printed so that you can complete them and reference them as you watch this video. To review, linguistic issues in the Bible have three areas of study. We talked about finding the original words of the Bible, something called textual criticism. Scholars look at the ancient copies of the Bible, the manuscripts, and they seek to determine what the original words are. Then when you have the original words, you need to know their meaning. And so we talked about using an interlinear Bible and Bible dictionaries and encyclopedias. Then finally, the question is, okay, you know the original words, you know their meaning, now what do? You have to translate this, communicate this to others who may not have access to Greek and know all the ins and outs of ancient language, language and culture, and understand what's being communicated. And so translation is a third area where scholars spend time talking about what's the best way to communicate this idea, this word, this concept from ancient Greek to today's languages. And so we're going to look in two particular sub-areas of this today. One, we're going to talk about the decisions that translators have to make. I always like to say that every Bible translation is great and every Bible translation is terrible because no two languages are the same, and so you have to make decisions when you translate. And so the best thing to do is to know the decisions that your translation has made, so you know the strengths of that translation as well as the weaknesses. And the second great thing to do is to compare translations so that you have a better understanding what's going on in the original text and not just the way that the translators feel it should be communicated. So with that in mind, let's begin by talking about approaches to translation, the general and basic decisions that must be made. Again, all Bible translations use the same critical editions of the Greek New Testament, the Nestle Aland and the United Bible Society. I showed you pictures of those in the 3F lesson. But there's still so many translations. If you go to Bible Gateway and look up in an English translation, there are a lot listed. All these are English translations. It's here at the top of the screen says English. And notice you just keep scrolling and scrolling. And so why are there so many translations if most, if not all of them, are based off the same critical editions of the Greek New Testament? Well, the basic decision to be made by translators that affects other decisions that they make is whether you should translate the words of the Bible or the ideas. That's the basic question to be asked. Translations that prioritize the words of Scripture are called literal translations or formal translations. Think of these kind of like your Google Translate translation, where you type in a word and the computer or device calculates what the equivalent word is. Now, if you've ever been caught for using Google Translate, the reason your teacher knows is because words change when they're put in context. And so a word might mean another word in one context, but when you put it in a sentence, all of a sudden another word should have been used, or the word order should have been changed, or something. And so this is the limits of an app like Google Translate, and that it isn't able to contextualize the language. So others seek to make a more smooth-sounding translation in that instead of translating the word for word and making the Bible sometimes sound awkward because the languages don't use the same word order or way of articulating an idea, other translations use the ideas of Scripture, and they're called dynamic translations. If you were in Bible class last year, you hopefully remember some of these terms and ideas. Sometimes translations seek a balance, and they're called mediating or middle translations. Because sometimes they focus on the words, but sometimes they focus on the meaning. And so they seek to do the best of both. When it makes more sense to focus on words, do the words. If it makes more sense to focus on the meaning, do the meaning. The next page has no blanks, but it's as a series of examples. And I'll highlight these and seek to explain them. So, in the Old Testament, so many of these will come from the Old Testament, as it's a little bit easier sometimes to show these points. In the Old Testament, there's an expression in the book of 1 Samuel that says, that's used in the verse that says, Saul went into the cave to cover his feet. Now, you may picture Saul going into some cave and putting leaves over his feet, or and then walking out, or you may ask, is he putting on his shoes, or what's going on? Well, this is a Hebrew idiom or expression that means to urinate, to take a pee, to relieve himself. And so an idiom is like a figure of speech, an expression. And every language has some. We often use them when there's something more uncomfortable that we're talking about. So, for instance, in class, you might raise your hand and say, can I go to the bathroom, or can I use the restroom? You are more specifically probably meaning, can I go take a pee, or can I cover my feet, or can I relieve myself? But that would be awkward, and people would look at you funny because it's more of a sensitive thing. And so we say, can I go to the bathroom? Not just meaning can I go, but can I do something in the bathroom? And we use this in other times where there's something uncomfortable. We sometimes might say that so-and-so died, but perhaps more often we'll say something like they passed away, or they went on, or they breathed their last, or there's something that sounds better because it's a sad thing to talk about death and uncomfortable things. So many bodily things, sexual things, death things, etc., etc. They use idioms because it's a more comfortable way of talking about something that's uncomfortable or personal. So the Bible's biblical Hebrew is the same way, and so there's the expression, Saul went into a cave and covered his feet. That's the literal translation. The problem is that most people don't know that expression, and so it can be confusing or mislead people in what the Bible is communicating. So approaches that are dynamic will just, again, focus on the meaning of the word. So again, the literal one is going the words. That's your Google translation. A dynamic translation focuses on the meaning. And so how do you translate the verse? You might say something like, Saul went into the cave to urinate. So as long as you know what the word urinate means, you know what he's doing. The problem with that is that the Hebrew could have said something more explicit, but didn't. It said something more sensitive to the issue. Perhaps because this is King Saul, after all. He's an important person, and let him have his privacy in the cave. And so a mediating translation might say something that isn't saying the same words, but it's using an idiom that we use. So Saul went into a cave to relieve himself. Now the Bible doesn't say he relieved himself. He uses the expression covered his feet. And to relieve himself does mean, but To relieve himself does mean to urinate, and yet it keeps that sense of privacy, that sense of respect, the sense of letting him have his dignity and doing his business on his own, and not us needing to embarrass King Saul. So, again, a meaning translation tries to do both. Get the meaning across so you can understand it, but also keeping the feel of the words, the sense. Another example is how to translate poetry. Poetry is especially hard to translate because there's certain rhymes and rhythms and play on speech and imagery used. And so, for instance, one of the most famous Bible passages is, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want," or "I shall not want." And this one, although it's a common expression, it does have some challenges if somebody is not familiar with the Bible. First, what does it mean that the Lord is my shepherd? But perhaps if you're familiar with concepts of the Bible and of the biblical God, that makes sense. Or if you're familiar with what a shepherd does, that makes sense. But if you grew up in a city and you're not familiar with the Bible, perhaps that might cause confusion. What does that mean? And so, and then likewise, when it says, "I shall not be in want," well, what does that mean? I want breakfast tomorrow. I want to hang out with my friends. I want to grow up and get a job or get married or whatever else. And so, what does it mean that that when the psalmist says, "I shall not be in want"? Well, a dynamic translation again might translate the meaning of the words. Again, dynamic translations translate the meaning. And so instead of saying, "The Lord is my shepherd," I might say, "The Lord takes care of me," because that's what shepherds do. They take care of their sheep and gives me all that I need. Oh, okay, it makes sense. So I may want something. The Bible's not saying I'll never have it, some kind of desire, but the sense is that I won't be in want, or I'll have what I need. But that kind of loses the poetry. There's a sense of, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," or "shall not be in want." There's a sense, the conciseness of it, and the fact that you have to think about it a little bit creates a certain beauty and power that if you just explain it is lost. And so a meaning translation might try to keep some poetic features or stylistic features, but not others. So perhaps, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in need." And so in this case, the shepherd image is kept, but instead of being want, it's changed to need. So it's changed for clarity. My shepherd, again, that image is kept. Another issue is gender. Like Spanish, Hebrew and Greek can use the masculine form of nouns to mean both genders. So in Spanish, hermanos means brothers, but it can also mean brothers and sisters. It can mean siblings. In English, if we said, "My brothers and I went to the store," you would assume that I'm talking about all boys, not boys and girls. So, do you keep the gender as masculine, but it can mean both? "Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord." Again, the man here means both men and women. It's not saying that if you're a woman and you trust in the Lord, well, God doesn't care about that. It means the person, but the word is only the man. So it says the man, but it means the person. So you could translate that, "Blessed is the man and the woman who trust in the Lord," or "those who trust in the Lord will be blessed." So it means both genders. And so in the dynamic translation, they'll translate to those. And that's called gender-inclusive language. It includes both genders. And that's on your study guide. It includes both genders, men and women. You're not excluding women. It's called gender inclusive. But when you go to college, that'll be something that is standard nowadays, where if you write a paper, you need to use gender inclusive language. How might a dynamic translate that? Well, sometimes they'll use gender inclusive language, but not in every case. So some Bible translations will always use gender inclusive language as much as possible. Mediating ones will tend to vary depending on the context of the verse and what it's trying to communicate. Another question to ask, and translators need to ask and answer, is how difficult do they want the text to be? Literal translations tend to be more difficult to read because they use expressions, idioms that we don't use today, and they use a larger vocabulary. So again, they may be more awkward, they may have a larger vocabulary because they're trying to translate word for word. Dynamic translations tend to be easy to read, and they're communicating the meaning of sentences. However, they sometimes lose the more complex vocabulary and style of the Old Testament and of the New Testament. And so again, it's easier to read, but sometimes you're losing important word choices, important nuances, important ambiguities, meaning sometimes the author purposely wants to be unclear so that the text can mean multiple things. And if you make it too straightforward, you lose that. Mediating translations, again, will tend to be in between the literal and dynamic in terms of difficulty. So if you're just getting familiar with the Bible or reading is a bit more challenging to you, you may want to start with a dynamic translation, but then as you get more familiar, try a mediating and or a literal translation, so you get the feel of how stories and letters and prophecies, etc., are told in these different translating styles. This next chart summarizes things that I've explained about what makes certain types of translations better, what makes them worse. And again, my motto is every translation's great and everyone's terrible. It all depends what you're looking for in a translation and being aware that your translation is making choices that causes it to have strengths but also causes it to have weaknesses. And so the best thing you can do, again, is to compare translations, which I'll show you later on in this video. Another issue that translators have to come to terms with is theological editing. And theological editing is how much should your translation reflect a particular theological viewpoint. Sometimes verses can be interpreted in different ways, or have maybe traditionally been interpreted one way, but maybe the translators feel it should be changed because of new research or new perspectives or whatever else. And so there are Bible translations that are Jewish, and they purposely make slight adjustments on verses that could point the reader to thinking that the verse is about Jesus. There's various ways I've read and studied these Jewish Bibles, and many of them have some great strengths, but one particular issue of note is that sometimes they are changing the words in slight ways, like a word can mean this or that, and they'll choose the one that allows them to have a non-Jesus interpretation. Christian Bibles actually do the same thing. At times they'll make decisions where they, in the reverse way, where a verse might not exactly point to Jesus, but if you change it slightly, it can. For instance, in Psalm 2 in the ESV, the English Standard Version, there's a verse about a king, and to show that that king is Jesus, the translators capitalize the H to show it's Jesus who is God and human. Now, in Hebrew, that H is not capitalized. There are no capital letters, and so that is their interpretation that it points to Jesus. But that's not necessarily the only way to read that, or perhaps even the best way to read that. So again, these Bibles, no matter what Bible, they're making certain decisions, and sometimes are trying to point you in a way that favors their interpretation. The same thing happens with Catholic and Protestant Bibles. If you don't know much about Christianity, there are different types of Christianity, different churches, and Catholic and Protestants agree on a lot of things, but they do disagree on some things, and so sometimes their Bible translations can have, again, these slight changes that point people to think that their view is more biblical than the other way to read the verse. Same thing can happen with liberal and conservative scholars and churches and Bibles, and so some Bibles are more wanting to change the way that the Bible's been read, while others will want to stick with more traditional ways of understanding the Bible. So, again, the main thing to do is be aware of the decisions your Bible translation is making, and compare translations, and that will awaken you to some of these slight changes that are going on, and you can research them more if you'd like. There's a handout that is attached to these notes, and it's on a different paper on your on Google Classroom, but I scrolled down here so it'd be easy to get to. And this is a chart I created to help students navigate Bible translations. There's lots of slight differences if you look at bold and underline and all that. I'll explain it starting on the main differences. The main difference is the types of Bibles. So these mainline Bibles are used at typically the oldest churches in America, and sometimes they have connections to the most prestigious universities. So there is the American Standard Version from the 1900, and the RSV, so the ASV and RSV. Those I put the abbreviations here in all the translations. And these are formal and literal. The middle translation in this camp is the NRSV. And dynamic translations from this type is the TEV and the CEV. Notice any translations in bold are available with or without the Apocrypha. That doesn't affect our class in the New Testament so much, but if you're interested in reading more of the Apocrypha, these ones in bold have versions that can include the Apocrypha, but not all versions do. Also, underlined Bibles use inclusive language, as we talked about, changing words so that both men and women are included. The NRSV in particular pretty much always uses inclusive language. So these are one school of Bible translations. Another school or type, overarching type, is evangelical translations. And these are by more conservative Christian churches, and many of them came about because people disagreed with the changes that were made to the Bible due to inclusive language or due to reinterpreting prophecies, so they didn't point to Jesus as directly or whatnot. So in these evangelical translations, they tend to favor, they tend to have more theological editing, as the translators tried to show certain things about the Bible. Again, some of these are formal, some of these are middle, and some of these are dynamic, or in particular the New Living Translation, although there have been others since 2000. I need to update this. One example of theological editing in the NIV, to show that the New Testament and Old Testament agree, they actually changed all Old Testament verses so that they use the exact same words that are found in the New Testament. But that often is not the case, because the New Testament is quoting from the Septuagint in Greek, while the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. And so there are differences, often slight, but differences nonetheless. And so this would be one example of where the NIV fudges the Old Testament translation, because they believe that if the New Testament words it a certain way, that must be what God wanted it to say. And again, versions in bold have the Apocrypha. Again, notice there's only one here because of the conservative views, perhaps, and also versions underline have the gender-inclusive language. There are also Catholic Bibles, and again, there are formal, literal, and there are middle. There aren't as so much dynamic Bibles that are Catholic because the Catholic Church has tended to favor translations that are literal or not changing as much as a dynamic translation often changes the text. There are British versions as well, and then again here there are Jewish Bibles. Finally, then I want to pay attention to a paraphrase Bible. Paraphrase Bibles are like super dynamic, meaning they change the Bible a lot. They're not based on the original languages, but rather on someone's kind of rewording of English versions. So for instance, the translator of the Way Bible read the King James Version and basically kind of reworded it in his own words. So again, it wasn't a school of scholars. It wasn't from the Greek and Hebrew. Perhaps you've heard of the Message. Many people often quote it. And again, that's kind of a paraphrase, commentary. Here's what I think the Bible verse is saying, not a scholarly, here's the Greek and the Hebrew and all that stuff. The Catholic Bible, the Jerusalem Bible also has the same example in that it was translated from French rather than Greek and Hebrew. So they change a lot, and for serious study of the Bible, I would recommend not reading them to try to find out what the Bible is actually saying. So all that goes to show that there are different translations, and there are different ways that Bibles fudge translations in order to show a particular viewpoint. Another issue to remember is that Bibles are made to be easier to read, many ones of today. The original Bible, again, had no, as you saw in the manuscripts, there were no headings, there were no verse numbers, there were no punctuation or paragraphs, or even space between words. And so the original Bible looked much different than the Bibles that we get today. Again, you see just straight capital letters in text. Sometimes there are certain breaks, but most of it is just, again, straight capital letters. Perhaps you can recognize some of these. So, Bibles today look much cleaner. They have paragraphs, they have headings, they have verse numbers, etc., so that it's easier to navigate them. One feature to note on Bible Gateway, if you'd like to get a more original feel of the Bible, and something I often try to do when I'm reading a book, want to experience it in a new way, is that you can take off these settings. So for instance, let's say you wanted to read the Gospel of John, we'll do John. And I'm going to put on chapter 1 through 3. Let's see, I was just going to start with 1 through 3. Well, here it comes up, and there's headings and verse numbers, etc., etc. But I could then is go to settings, and I could take off footnotes. I could take off verse numbers. I could take off headings. And all of a sudden, now I have the text more in the way it would have been felt in its original writings. There's still paragraphs, there's still periods, there's still spaces between words, but you have a more natural read, and you get to decide where you're going to start and where you're going to stop, rather than stop at some arbitrary chapter or verse or heading mark. So, now, let's talk about, we just mentioned the word footnotes. We're going to talk about footnotes some more. We talked about these the other day with text critical footnotes, but now we're going to see that there are also translation footnotes that help explain the decisions that scholars made. So let's look, for example, at Mark 1:40. And for our examples, I'm going to use the NRSV. But you could use, sorry. All right, so here's Mark 1:40, and I'll have to turn the footnotes back on. And notice it says here, there's a couple of footnotes. One of them says that the terms leper and leprosy can refer to several diseases. The other one says other ancient authorities lack kneeling. For our purposes now, let's look at this first example where the term, it explains that the word leper or leprosy can refer to several diseases. Again, that's not originally in the Bible. There was no footnote that explained that, but scholars put these in to explain that the word leper or leprosy can mean several different things. Not just what's commonly thought of to be leprosy, where people lose digits on their fingers or their nose or whatnot, can mean a variety of diseases. And we'll say skin conditions. So let's now look at how we can actually apply this as we read the Bible. The first thing that we can do is pay attention to footnotes. We can identify and interpret translation footnotes. There are two main types of translation footnotes. There's text critical footnotes, there's extra information footnotes, but for translation footnotes, the words will either say or with all capital letters, and that's called an alternative translation footnote. Meaning that you could translate it this way or that way. The other type of footnote was a literal footnote, and that can be marked as either saying GK for Greek or LIT for literal. And the translators will acknowledge that they changed the words of the Bible, and they put these footnotes in here because they want you to know they had to make a decision, and here's what they did. Let's look at two examples now, Mark 1:2 and Mark 1:15. Notice in Mark 1:2, I'm going to skip the first footnote. I want to focus on the second one, where it says, GK before your face. And here what it's saying is that in Greek, it reads, the literal words are, see, I am sending my messenger before your face. And so that means, again, here in footnote B, that they changed the words from saying ahead of you to before your face. Because we don't use that expression, I'm going before your face. We say, I'm going ahead of you, I'm going in front of you. But in Greek, the words are, I'm going before your face. So this would be an example where the text says, I am sending my messenger ahead of you. But the footnote tells us it literally is, I am sending my messenger before your face. And so this is how we can mark this and reflect on it, whether or not it's significant and why. And again, so we mark the text, and then the footnote, we'd say, I'm going to use these hashtags to save writing. I'm sending my messenger before your face. And we could ask, is that important? Is it just that they're telling us so that they know that we change the words if we're using a Greek Bible and trying to study in Greek? Those are the questions we can think about as we think about this footnote. The second example is in Mark 1:15. And in Mark 1:15, there's twice that this happens. It says, the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God has come near. Or, I'm sorry, it's not all capital letters here, but it is a different, you see the other letters are italicized. Or is at hand. And the same thing, believe in the good news. Or you could translate it, believe in the gospel. Let's stick with the second one as we write to keep it simpler and less writing. So in our example in our notes, we could write that the text says, believe in the good news. However, it would be just as fine to write, again, this is an alternative translation, meaning it could be this or that. Again, this is called a literal Greek translation. The second example. And the footnote says, believe in the gospel. So in Greek, it's only one word, but you could translate that word to mean good news, the good news. And again, you ask yourself, is it more important to use good news or gospel? What would make more sense in the context I'm in? Because either one is acceptable because it's an or alternative footnote. And you'll have a worksheet to complete after this video lecture where you'll practice using these footnotes and seeking to identify the type and how to analyze them. In fact, we'll practice this real quick. In this footnote, here's your picture of your homework that you'll do after this video lecture. You're going to go to Bible Gateway. There's a link in Google Classroom. And you're going to type in 1 Peter 1. That means you'll read the first chapter of 1 Peter. However, and also make sure you use the NRSV. So we all use the same translation, get the same footnotes. As you complete this assignment, you're going to do a couple of things. The first thing you're going to do is write down the chapter and verse of the footnote. So let's practice this by going to Bible Gateway. And again, I'm going to type in 1 Peter 1 Peter 1. And if you're not seeing chapters and verses, go to Settings. Make sure you have footnotes turned on. And I'll put verse numbers head on and turned on. And if it's easier, you can actually just scroll to the bottom and you'll see which verses have the footnotes. So the first footnote is in verse 1:6. And by the way, for this homework, you just need to do example A, B, C. Just A, B, and C. You don't need to do all of them. A, B, and C will be enough. So let's look. And again, here is what your assignment looks like. And the first thing you got to do is write down the reference. So you'd write 1:6. And then you write the text as it appears in the Bible. So if you click on that, it brings you right to it. And it says, "In this you rejoice." That's what it says in the Bible. Again, you don't need to read the whole chapter. Just read the part with the footnote. So you write, "In this you rejoice." And then you're going to write the alternate or literal reading as provided in the footnote. So in this case, "in this you rejoice" could also be translated "rejoice in this." And because it's an "or," you're going to write that it's an alternative footnote. So if we go back to the worksheet, we would see we could write that the alternate reading is "rejoice in this." And for the purpose of this worksheet, you can cross off the significance, why changed. And again, I'm going to, since we just did this one together, I'm going to give you, again, there's 3 examples to do. One other thing you need to do is tell the type. And so here are the 4 types of footnotes we've talked about. And you got to decide, is it text critical? That's what we talked about in our lecture on Friday. Is it an alternative translation? Is it stating what the Greek literally says? Or is it providing other helpful information? Again, the text critical will mention manuscripts or authorities. An alternative translation will start with the word "or." A literal Greek one will either say "GK" or it'll say "lit." And other information will just be none of the above. So it won't do any of those. So let's go back and look at this example we just looked at. It says, "or in this," or "rejoice in this." And so that tells us that the kind of footnote we're looking at is an alternative translation because it starts with the word "or." So down here we write 1:6, alternative translation. And that's what your example should look like. And I'd like you again to complete You don't have to do all of them, but I'd like you to look through and go through examples B, C, and E. B, C, and E. B, C, E. So please mark that, B, C, and E. Again, you can skip the significance, why changed, and just focus on the text and literal reading. And this should be done after you watch a video today. Finally then, the last skill I want to talk about, which will also be on your quiz on Thursday, is being able to compare translations. And the best way to do this, if we go back up to our notes, the best way is to either compare a formal or literal, a dynamic, and a meaning translation. So we get a different type of translation in each column, or to translate a mainline, a Catholic, and a mainline, a Catholic, and an evangelical translation. And so in that instance, we would have a different type in each row, in each section. So you might want to do the RSV versus the ESV versus the Dewey Rhymes, or the NRSV versus the NIV versus the NAB, or NABRE. So again, those would be two different ways you could to compare translations. So how do you compare translations? Well, first, again, you need to know what translations you're going to want to use, but then it's easy. Let's just keep the same passage open. Actually, let's go to the example of the verse we're going to look at as our practice example. It says John 7:39, and we're going to use comparing a mainline with an evangelical translation with a Catholic Bible. And let's see how this verse is translated in each of these. John 7:39. And I'll start with so you start with the one version you want, and then once you have the screen looking like this, you click the button all the way to the right of the settings, and that creates a parallel translation. And if you click it again, you get a third version, and you want to make sure they match the ones you want. So in this case, we have the NRSV, the NIV, and I also want the NAB, or in this case, NABRE. And so here we have our three verses, and then what we want to do is read these. And just like we did comparing the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and what was similar, what was different, we want to do the same thing here. So in John 7:39, the NRSV, it says, "Now he said about the Spirit, which believers in him were to receive, for as yet there was no Spirit, because Jesus was not yet glorified." In the NIV, it says, "By this he meant that the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were later to receive, up to that time the Spirit had not been given, since Jesus had not yet been glorified." Notice it's a bit longer than the NRSV because they add more to this second sentence. The NRSV says there was no Spirit, but this says that the Spirit had not been given. Let's see what the NABRE says. He said this in reference to the Spirit that those who came to him to believe in him were to receive. There was, of course, no Spirit yet, because Jesus had not yet been glorified. And so both the NABRE and the NRSV say that there wasn't the Holy Spirit before Jesus was glorified. But that creates some questions about because the Old Testament mentions the Holy Spirit and whatnot. And so the NIV, this is an example of theological editing, changed the wording so that it sounds like the Spirit existed but just hadn't been given. And we could research this more. The point of this is that by finding a difference in the translation, you then know more questions to research. So on your quiz, you'll have a question like this, and I want to see that you can look up 3 different translations and that you can compare their wording. And your answer should look like something like this. It'll be a question form. Why do the NRSV and NABRE say that there was no Spirit yet So why do they say there was no Spirit yet? But the NIV says Jesus had not yet given the Spirit. Again, the purpose of this question on your quiz will be to just be able to be aware of ways to study the Bible. I'm not looking for you to answer that question. I want you to be aware of these different questions that you could research, not seek to find answers for them. Well, this concludes our notes today. I would like you, in addition, again, to completing BCE on worksheet 3E, I'd also like you to send a screenshot of 3 translations open side by side. And I'd like it to be the same translations that I used in my video. So, again, you should have the NRSV on one column, the NIV in another, and the NABRE in the third. So send me a screenshot that looks like this. I don't care what Bible verse you pick, but pick a Bible verse, put up the 3 versions, and send me a screenshot. And don't send me of John 7:39. And that's it. Thank you.